All right, there we go. We are recording. Fantastic. I'll go through a few housekeeping notes, and then we'll talk about what I like to call the reason for me conducting these things. And we talked about that last week, and that was to ease anxiety. And I think when we ended last week, that most of the individuals who are attending indicated that we had achieved that goal, and we hope to do the same thing again. Now, this week I'm focusing on the discussion for those individuals, again, that are taking the research course. And as I mentioned, regardless of what you're taking, if you're taking a research course or if you are doing a quantitative study, or even if you're doing a qualitative study, recall I discussed that a literature review should be an exhaustive review of the literature on your topic. And by that, that means you don't just select quantitative literature or qualitative literature. You are going to give the reader an exhaustive review of what we know about the topic. And of course, that's both quantitative and qualitative research. So, any quantitative training that you take will be helpful to you in your doctoral journey, okay? But as you saw last week, one of the critical things that we had to understand were the 4 scales of measurement before we could even go on and start trying to run those visual displays of data, as you can recall that. And you'll see this week, the same concept applies. You must first understand those scales of measurement because there are certain statistics, descriptive statistics that we can and we cannot show or do based on the scale of measurement of the data, okay? And we'll get into descriptive statistics. And then we'll look at that discussion exemplar for those individuals that may be taking the course, okay? And we'll look into SPSS live and go through the procedures. And again, I'm using version 29. So if you have a different version, you may see some things that look a little bit different. But again, you should be able to quickly capture up and get to where we are. And again, we'll leave you with quantitative resources, a survey, and then we'll conclude. So now housekeeping. This session is recorded. So yes, I did hit the record button. And as usual, you'll be able to go out to a few places to look at the recording as an on-demand recording. I should try to get the YouTube one out this evening, okay? This one from ORDS will probably be out sometime tomorrow. This one I can do myself. I need someone to intervene to do this one, okay? As always, please mute your lines. Let's be courteous to each other. My responsibilities are to provide safe, friendly, non-intimidating, and hopefully a very fun learning environment. Okay, this is not a general statistics seminar or a complaint seminar. And by that, I mean that I'm going to focus on the abstract content. And we are here for descriptive statistics and specific contents of descriptive statistics. So let's try to limit it to that because we have a very short amount of time, okay? There's the link to the survey because you will be given a copy of the presentation and the exemplar. And disregard the knowledge check. If you want to take a look at that, you can. But here's just something that I put out there, and you can just kind of click on this link. And I think there's maybe 5 or 6 questions on descriptive statistics. And again, just optional and for something for you to test your skills and knowledge if you choose to do so. Okay. Now, remember, the focus of this, as we said last week, was to ease anxiety. Okay. I think we all know that we can never take a 45-minute session in anything in statistics and come away an expert. You're not being asked to be an expert. What my goal is to ease your anxiety by introducing you to these concepts and hopefully in a very understandable term so that you can then take that information and apply it to what you have to do, be that reading a journal article or doing an application assignment or writing up something for your dissertation, etc. And once we have an understanding of what we're doing, that kind of eases the anxiety. So we'll do an anxiety check at the end to see if we have taken that face from over here to the left and hopefully have you looking like the individual on the right, okay? Now, you have a discussion that's due if you're taking the course. And you'll see that we're going to be doing descriptive statistics, okay? And by day 3, you have to do certain things. And you're going to have a continuous variable. And this is where we talk about, the scales of measurement. And you're going to have to report some statistics. Now, perhaps this looks a little Greek to you right now, and you're not quite understanding, okay, what am I doing? And what should my results look like? How should I submit this? What does all this mean? And hopefully, you'll have a better understanding of that in the next 30 to 45 minutes, okay? Now, before we go any further, I think everyone understands how important I think the scales of measurement are. And that's really understanding the makeup of the data, the makeup of the variables that you are using. And we start out with a nominal variable. And we know that's the categorical variable. We don't have any numerical value, meaning we don't do any mathematics with it, but we will code, males and females, say with a 1 and a 2, etc. But we don't use that variable for any purposes of any type of mathematical calculation. For example, I couldn't ask you what is the average of male and female. There's no such thing. Okay, so it's a categorical variable. Excuse me. And you'll see here that there are certain descriptive statistics that we can run for categorical data and certain things we can't do. So that's why it's important. Just like last week, there were certain graphs that we could run for nominal data, and there were certain graphs that we couldn't run for nominal data. Does everybody understand that? Remember that concept, because that same thing applies here today. So that scales of measurement is very important, okay? The next scale of measurement that we may be dealing with is a variable that's an ordinal scale. And as it starts out, ORD, kind of order, and it's a ranking order. We probably all have filled out some survey where someone is asking us on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 to rate something. But again, we go, into some kind of a hierarchy order, okay? So for example, likely, more likely, very likely. But as you can see, each number kind of goes up in order, okay? They're not kind of arbitrary. Now, the next one will be the interval. And the interval are equal intervals, but there's no true zero value. And what do we mean by that? Well, let's just say that you were measuring weather, and you got up one day and you measured the weather on today's date, and it was 0 degrees. Well, that doesn't mean that there's no true zero value. In other words, it doesn't mean that there is no temperature or no existence of temperature. It simply means that it's probably very cold, depending on where you are and who you are. So as you can see, a lot of variables may have no true zero value, and that would be an interval variable. Then you have the highest order, which is the ratio. And that we have the equal intervals, just as we have with the interval, but the distinguishing characteristic is that we have a true zero value, okay? So a certain response can be 0, meaning, 0 reading achievement, 0 age, 0 weight, or something of that nature. Some score or something that you're measuring, and a person scores a 0 on that. It can be a true 0 value, okay? Now, that's very important to understand, because this dictates what we can and what we cannot do in terms of descriptive statistics, okay? Now, for further reading on the scales of measurement, you can click down here on the bottom on this slide here, scales of measurement video tutorial. When you get this, put it in slideshow, or either copy and paste this link, and that'll take you to a more in-depth tutorial on the scales of measurement, okay? So everybody okay with the scales of measurement? Again, that's a recap, but that's very important to understand those scales of measurement. Because anytime you look into a data set, as I mentioned last week, one of the first things I want you to do is you start looking at data and looking at variables is to go to that scale of measurement column to make sure you understand what type of variable you are dealing with, okay? Now, at this point, what I'm going to do is I'll go ahead and I'm going to stop the show. And I will go into SPSS. And I just want you to take a look at the scales of measurement once again and how that applies. Now, what I have here is a data set open, just as you would open up a data set for your exercise or application. And as you can see down at the bottom here, I have a data view that I just clicked on. And this is where the actual raw data is sitting, the responses that the individuals gave. So for example, I clicked on row number 1. That's one individual's responses. So person number 1, the gender was female. That education level, the person had a um, completed undergraduate, et cetera, et cetera. Person number 1 was married. So again, just want to reacquaint you to what you're looking at when you look at a data set. They asked an individual or gave the individual an instrument to measure their stress score. So person number 1 had a stress score of 29. Person number 2, of course, a stress score of 22, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the data view. But now the variable view that I'm clicking on now, down at the bottom, you see there's a data view and a variable view here. And this is where my variable makeup is put in place. Setting up a data file, understanding the scales of measurement. Now, for example, let's take a look at the gender variable. Now, we know that gender is categorical. And in this case, we have male and females. But how do we know that? And notice that it says nominal. We have to make sure that it's selected nominal. So when you click in here, you see that you have choices of nominal, ordinal, and scale. Now you say, well, you just said, Dr. Taylor, that we have interval and ratio, and I don't see that. Well, the interval and ratio are represented by the scale. So it doesn't matter if it's interval or ratio, you would just select scale. But now notice here again for gender, it's nominal, meaning it's categorical, but we must always look into the values column. And notice this tells us what the variable makeup is, or what the gender makeup is, or how we categorize gender. So you'll notice the little 3 dots here. When you click on them, you'll get the breakout. You see the value labels. And in this data set, this researcher said for males, I'm going to code them as a 1, and for females, I'm going to code them as a 2. Now, these 1s and 2s are not used for any mathematical purposes whatsoever. It's simply just adding categories. Now, let's just say that I wanted to add a 3rd category and make that category non-binary, an individual that doesn't associate with the male or the female response. Well, what the data set would look like, you would hit the plus here, and you would add the next code, which would be a 3, and you would say non-binary. And that's how that's set up and made. But you're going to be working with data sets that are already in place for you. But it's important, I think, for you to understand what's going on in that data set and what you're looking at and what those things mean. So that's what's happening. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this one here. But that's what's happening. Let's take a look at one more. Let's look at, we got marital status here. Okay. We know that that's categorical because it's nominal. And let's look at the different categories. So here we've got 8 marital status categories, and each individual is in one of these 8 categories, okay? So I want to make sure you understand the underlying structure of a data file when you're looking at that, because you'll want to understand that when you start selecting data and variables to run certain descriptive statistics, okay? Are we okay with that? Everybody okay at this point? Okay, fantastic. And that was just kind of a recap there. Now let's get back to the presentation and let's look at descriptive statistics. Now, when we start talking about statistics, you have 2 major categories. And those categories are what we call descriptive and inferential. Now, The descriptives are exactly what that word means. We are getting ready to describe the data. We're not going to do any statistical analysis. If you've looked ahead into your syllabus, you'll see that later on in subsequent weeks, you'll be running statistical tests, things such as a t-test and a ANOVA, et cetera. And don't worry about that now. Trust me, you'll be well prepared. But suppose you just want to say how many males, how many females, how many were widowed, how many were this, how many were that. That's describing the data. And remember, we did the same thing last week, but we just kind of described the data using visual displays, graphs. We're going to do the same thing tonight, but we're just going to now use numbers to describe the data, okay? Now, and that's exactly what we're going. We're going to describe, organize, and summarize this vast amount of information. Remember when we looked into the data file, and let's do that again right quick. Okay, where's that? Now, let's look at the data. Now look at this. This makes no sense to anybody. It's a lot of information. Look at me scroll here. I've got all of this information. And if I went down to the bottom, let's see, I have about 400 and something records. You could be working with a data file that has thousands of records, 439 records. But now, suppose I just quickly wanted to say, well, I wonder how many were male and how many were female. Well, we're not going to go count 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to run descriptive statistics, and we can do that for all of these variables, okay? And that's where we're going to get to. So now let's get back to the presentation. And we know what descriptive statistics is. Now, let's talk about two main types of descriptive statistics. The first one is we're going to call measures of central tendency. And just look at those words real carefully. Central tendency. Central tendency. Now, if I was just looking at that outside of the context of statistics or something, I would say center means, kind of in the middle, a center point around something. And tendency is kind of like the inclination of things to do something. So I would say that means the tendency of data to hover around a central point. That's what we mean by central tendency. The most probably commonly understood measure of central tendency for continuous data is the mean or the average. And we all are familiar with that. And now, remember we said that the scales of measurement is important? Well, you can only do that for continuous data or numerical data. You can't calculate the average for a categorical data. Remember, male and female. You can't do that. So you need to make sure you look at the scale of measurement, make sure it's numerical or continuous, what we call it. So for example, here we have three numbers that equal 30. You divide them by 3. The average of this is 10. So if this was the data plotted here over here to the right, okay, the average is sitting right here in the middle, the center point, the central point. What we're describing with central tendency is how the data as a whole tend to hover around that central point. You see how the arrow is pointing toward the center? Describe the data in terms of how well things kind of align and come to the average. How close are you to the average value? And we normally will run and report the mean when we have data that has a normal distribution. And we'll talk about that. So you don't just start clicking and running running measures of central tendency. You really want to look at the data and see what measure of central tendency is the best to run. Okay? Now, we have continuous data. But we also have something, you've probably heard of something called the median. Now, to describe data in terms of the median, we're talking about a middle value, and it's more of a position versus a value. And what do I mean by that? Here I have data lined up, 3 data points, 3, 4, 7, 9, and 179. Now look at that. We can see that 179, that's really, really different, or almost an outlier, not almost, a severe outlier. Would it be appropriate to report the average? No, it wouldn't. So when we have data, when there's extreme outliers, we would run the median. Now let's put this into a real life example. Let's talk about Apple, the company Apple Computer Company. And let's just say that you go online and you find the average salary is, say, $100,000 per employee, $100,000. Now, suppose you took Tim Cook, who was the CEO of Apple, and included his salary and tried to come up with a measure of central tendency. You take $100,000 salaries and then you add a $10 million salary in there. That is going to significantly skew your data. And you don't get a good measure if you say average. That would make the average income somewhere about $2 million. And those employees will tell you, it is no way that I make anywhere near. So you see how it can be deceiving. So when you have that extreme outlier, the median is the best value. Sometimes you'll see reported the median income in an area. It means that that data has some extreme outliers. There's some pieces of data where that income is extremely higher than most of the other incomes that are hovering around here, or either extremely lower. Does that make sense? Does that concept of understanding that you have to understand the data to understand what's the appropriate central tendency? Okay, so normal distribution, the mean, we have extreme outlier, we report the median. Now, another measure of central tendency that we can look at, but it's for categorical data, okay? The gender or some other variable is categorical. Now, but let's take a look at this. These are just values here. Now, take a look at this. 2, 4, 5, and 8. Those are the 4 numbers that are in this distribution. The 2 only occurs twice. The 4 occurs 3 times. The 5 occurs once. The 8 occurred 8 times. So 8 individuals perhaps responded as an 8. That is the most frequent value, and that would be the mode, okay? So you're here things like the mean, median, and modes. Now let's do something right quick. Let's go back and let's look at the exemplar. You see what we have to report, the mean, median, and modes? We're going to do that for some data, okay? Now, the other thing is that when we describe data, instead of looking at how the data tends to hover around this central point, we can describe the data from its tendency to disperse away from a central point. So does everyone see now the arrows are going away, the arrowheads are going away from the central point versus in the previous slide, they were going toward. So how does the data tend to vary away from a central point? That's the other measure of central tendency. So we have the measures of central tendency, and measures of variability. Those are 2 major descriptive statistics. Now, if it's continuous data, where we looked at, say, the average, we always look at the standard deviation, okay, for the normal data. So we would report, and this is kind of like the average distance that each score was from the average. Now, another thing that we could use for continuous data is the range. And that's just simply the distance between the highest and the lowest values. So if you had a data set and it ignores the distribution, you're not worried about if it's a normal distribution or anything. You're saying that the lowest value I had was a 6 and the highest I had was a 32. If I did the math, the range was 26, okay? And the beauty of this is that SPSS does all of this for you. You just have to just start getting an understanding of what these concepts are once you look at the output, okay? Now, when we start talking about, run this or run that based on the distribution, let's talk about the standard bell curve. This is a very important concept in statistics. And when you talk about describing data, you're normally describing data as it relates to this normal distribution. Now, what is the normal distribution? We all have heard it, we've read about it, we've heard the bell curve, etc. What does it truly mean? Well, what it is that it's a statistical phenomenon and really a natural phenomenon, meaning that if you were to take 100 people and we say we want to get your GPA scores, 100 people would give us their GPA scores. Now, if we random sample 100 people and we got your GPA scores, what we're saying is that look inside the blue here, the blue arrow. Right here is the average. Let's just say the average is 3.5, okay? And let's just say the standard deviation is 1 point. That means that 1 point, from 3.5 going backwards, that would be 2.5, and going 1, it would be 4.5. We're saying that 68% of the people will fall within 1 standard deviation plus or minus. But if we extended the standard deviation to 2 standard deviations, we're saying that 95% of the people that we sampled fall within 2 standard deviations. And then we're saying that majority of everybody in any statistical phenomenon, almost 99.7% of everybody's score will fall within plus or minus 3 standard deviations. Now, what do we have out here in the purple? These are the outliers. This case is the individuals that scored extremely low. Over here is that overachiever that had that perhaps 4.5 GPA. This is what we mean by the bell curve, and that's a natural phenomenon, okay? So for example, if we had anxiety was measured, we randomly sampled people. The average anxiety score was 42, but a standard deviation, remember, kind of like a plus or minus 2 points. So with 1 standard deviation, it would be 40 to 44 because 42 minus 2 would be 40, but 42 plus 2 would be 44. So it's kind of like a range. So, but 68% of the people would fall within this range. 95% of us would fall within the green range, and 98% of us would fall within the black range. And some of us are going to have very, very low anxiety over here. And some of us, our anxiety is going to be off the roof. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, now, so having said that, we need to understand the distribution of the data. Remember to understand, do we run the average or do we run the median, etc.? Does everybody understand that concept now? So we need to understand how the data looks. so that we can run the appropriate statistics. Now, one of the main things is skewness. You've heard that term. And notice in the middle, here is a very normal distribution. Remember, we have the 68%, the 95%. Out here would be those outliers. But data normally a lot of times doesn't look like that. Here we have a negative skew. And what does that mean? Here is the average score. And what happens? Where are all of the majority of the scores? Are they above the average or below? Where would you say? The average score, the scores are where? Above or below the mean? They are above the mean, going to the right. So this will be a negatively skewed distribution. So for example, if you were a teacher and you gave a test and the data was negatively skewed, that means that everybody did pretty well on that test. You had an average score, but the majority of the students fell above the average. Does that make sense to everybody? Do you see that? I want to make sure that you understand what you're looking at here. Okay, fantastic. Now, this means that, we had that 68% within one standard deviation, 95 and 99. Now, what's happening in the positively skewed? If this is the average score here, what happened in this class scores? Everyone scored well below the mean to the left. So this class didn't do too well because if this is the average score here, majority of the scores were over here. Remember we said the mode is what occurred the most? So right here, whatever that score was, the majority of the people were here, but it was well below the mean. Does everybody see that from a very global perspective and just kind of understand now what we mean by skew and negative skew and positive skew? If you looked at a chart and said, yeah, okay, everybody scored well or didn't score well, etc. Now, let's take a look at this, a negative skew, and we measured self-esteem. So if this red line here is the average score, and the average score was 33.5, and the standard deviation was 5 points, we see that now this is frequency here, okay, meaning how many. And we see here that the frequencies that there are few scores on the lower end. It looks like there's more space here, but I'm looking at the frequencies. Notice these frequencies up here close to 50. So 50 people, close to 50 people scored a 40. You see, so most of the people scored here. So again, you have fewer scores on the lower end. And this is that negative skew. So what would we say? Self-esteem tends to be somewhat overall high. Overall, the sample reported high measures of self-esteem. Do you see how just looking at this now can kind of give you that type of information once we understand the concepts of the bell curve? Yes, no, maybe so. Okay, now, fantastic. So now let's take a look at something else called kurtosis, and we're not going to worry much about that. But not only are we learning about the shape, but we could also worry about the tails of the distribution. And you see these tails have different shapes and look different. Don't worry too much about that. But what that usually means is that depending on these tails, a lot of data in here means there's a lot of outliers. Remember we said that this is past that 99% point here. So anyway, but that's not important at this point. Now, look at this. We're going to run an output, and all the answers to these questions are going to be here. The mean is going to be right here, 26.73. The median is going to be 26. The mode is going to be 25. And you know now that the value that occurred the most is the mode. The median is that position. And so these are pretty close together. That tells me this is pretty much a good normal distribution. Okay. We got the standard deviation, variance. Remember we talked about skewness, range, All of that information is there. Now, in this case, what we're going to do is now look at an example for a continuous variable, okay? And now, the exemplar that you're going to get is going to look like this. So by day 3, you're going to post, present, and report a descriptive analysis for your variables. And you're going to select the variable. Now remember, in the data set you use, you're going to select a continuous variable. So I would select a scale variable, remember? And as you can see, the means, the median, the modes are just right from the output. But what might be the better measure for central tendency? And remember, we looked at the charts and we said the mean is appropriate when the distribution is normal. And so we'll see that the distribution is normal. And so you're telling the reader that the mean is the best. Suppose there was a significant outliers. What would be the best mode? If there were significant outliers, what would be the best measure of central tendency? If you select a variable and there's a lot of outliers, what would you report? The median. Exactly, Carrie. You got it. Exactly. And you're going to explain why it's the best measure. And from your readings, you'll understand the standard deviation is right from the report. The variance is right from the report. And then how would you describe the data? And overall, I would describe the data as having a normal distribution with very few outliers. And there's slight skew, but it doesn't, appear to be anything extreme. And so the outliers do not appear extreme enough to skew the distribution. So whatever variable that you choose, it's going to look differently. And then you're going to tell the reader just kind of how would you describe the data. Now, the important thing is how do we do that? But also you're going to do it for a categorical variable. So now you see the same thing. What is the, for the categorical variable? And now the source of stress, you see it for your categorical variable, report a frequency distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And we did that. Here's the frequency distribution right here, okay? Now, describing the data, what's the biggest source of stress for this group of people? Just look at this and tell me. That data set with 490 records, right quickly, you can tell me what's the greatest source of stress for these individuals? Work, 51%. You see how you have described that data so quickly? The least source of stress is probably spouse or partner. In relationships, they're saying the least. So you see how now you can start talking about the data and making sense of all of those records that were in the SPSS file. Now, the exemplar, how do we do it? In SPSS, you're going to click on Analyze, Clearly Descriptive Statistics, right there in front of you. Now, remember, this is for the continuous variable because you have to do this for a continuous and a categorical variable. So this is for the continuous. Now, you're going to put your variable in here. Now, what we're looking at is the total perceived stress. So stress was a scale variable, and I want to see, the results of that. Okay, excuse me, let me go back. So here's the exemplar. Okay, and so we're going to analyze descriptive statistics, and then what we'll do here is we'll go into frequencies, and we'll go into statistics, total perceived stress. And now here, what we want is the mean, the medians, and the modes, okay? And remember, these are numerical values. Average, the median score when we have the outliers, and the mode is the one that occurs the most. And you see, we can just, the measures of dispersion. Remember, we talked about central tendency. Let me highlight that. And you'll see that everything is in this report: central tendency and dispersion or variability. So remember the standard deviation, the variance, the range, all those things you are asked for to report in your assignment. Here all that is. Skewness, kurtosis. Just select all that, you hit continue, and what happens is you get the output that you need. The mean score, the median, the mode, the standard deviation, skewness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's as simple as that, okay? Now, but you also have to do that for the categorical variable, right? So for the categorical variable, we're going to do the same thing, but that's going to be source of stress is going to go in there. And in statistics, now, we'll select the same things, but you'll note, and the reason I did this, you'll see that we don't get standard deviations and variances and ranges. They won't really make any sense. Remember I said, because you can't do mathematical calculations from that. So when we hit continue, but now you see what we get with the frequency distribution. You see all of this information here, and these are the categories. And notice work 224, spouse 12, relationships, etc., etc. So basically, the point is that what you'll do is give me a second. Let me go back. You'll end up with two outputs, one for your continuous and one for your categorical, okay? Now, what happens is that you then are going to just take that information and you'll transcribe that into the exemplar. Now, let me stop here and get into the exemplar and bring that up for you, okay? Let me find that. Now, this is the document I'm going to put into the chat, okay? And as you'll see, it's the exemplar. And as you can see, the continuous variable that I use was total perceived stress. And I said that was selected for the continuous variable. And through the procedures that you have to run, you'll get the mean, the medians, and the modes. And then you type in, what would be the best measure for central tendency and all of that information. And then here you have the categorical variable here. And you'll see now that it just tells us the frequency or the count in each category. And the percent each count is of 100, okay? And that's what you see here, okay? So in other words, work was 51% of the source of stress out of these 7 or 8 categories. And that's what you're looking at. But do you see now how you have described data and made sense again of this? All of this now that you're looking at, that makes no sense when we look at it in the data view. SPSS does the work for us and creates the descriptive statistics that we just looked at. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So the exemplar, now let's do some things here. Let me first make sure that we get everything into the chat for you. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the exemplar in there for you, okay? Okay, now check in the bottom of the chat and it should be a descriptive statistics exemplar. I think that is. And then I'm going to put the presentation in there now, okay? Now check and make sure that you see the descriptive statistics PowerPoint presentation. Does everybody see that? So at the bottom, you should have the exemplar and you should have the presentation. Okay? Okay, fantastic. Now, the next thing that I want to show you, as we talk about resources, okay, you'll get this slide presentation. But I'm going to take you out here to the ORD's website right quick, okay? And show you. Give me a second. Now, what's going to happen, my friends, is that sometime tomorrow, and I'll put the link again in the chat, but you have it in the presentation. As you'll see tonight, we had the descriptive statistics seminar, upcoming seminar. We did that tonight. The link will go down here to the on-demand quantitative seminars once the recording is ready and it's placed down here. Remember last week we did the visual displays of data? Those of you that didn't attend and want to look at that, and these are all the sessions that are out there that have been conducted. So for example, as you go through the term, if you're taking the course and say you get to the week of where you're doing the repeated measures t-test, or you're doing binary logistics regression, if you haven't received an announcement that there will be a live session, just go to this link here and click and look at one of the previously recorded sessions. And it's the live session just like we do, and you'll get the same type of information, etc. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so now, first of all, let me go ahead and put the link here. And I'm going to put that link in the chat, but you have that in the presentation, okay? And someone is saying I sent two presentations, so I need to put an exemplar in, okay? Let me do that. Okay, the exemplar should now be in the bottom there. So again, this is where that information will be. And as you can see, there's pretty much a topic for everything that's coming up if you're taking the course. But if you're doing a quantitative study for your dissertation, all of this will be helpful information. Now, the other place, the link that I'm going to send you to will be here. Okay. And this one I should have the recording hopefully sometime later on this evening. But this is the little YouTube page that I put together, okay? And as you can see, all of the videos around here, okay? So this one will show up here hopefully sometime later on this evening. So I'm going to take this link and I'm going to put that in there. But again, it's in the presentation, okay? And you have that, all righty? So other than that, I don't have anything else other than I really and strongly encourage you to please take advantage of filling out the survey. That really helps. And it helps me continue to go down either the right path or diverge and go down a different path if this isn't working for you. But what I like to do, and I always like to do, is when I end these sessions, I like to go back to this slide. Did we move you from over here to over here regarding descriptive statistics? Fantastic. And if nothing, remember now, you have an understanding. If nothing, you can look at the exemplar and you can say, okay, I know what I'm being asked. If nothing, you can do that. You have some context. I have this data set that I'm opening up, and I'm going to describe this data set. but I need to describe this data set based on it being, a continuous variable or a categorical variable. And this is exactly what that application or discussion is asking you to do, okay? And here it is, continuous variable here and the categorical variable, okay? So like, for example, now what I like to do is let's just take a quick example before we go here. And let's just take a look at something here. Let's go analyze descriptive statistics. And I just go descriptive. So now that means that I'm going to SPSS is starting to move slow. And as you can see, total perceived stress. I'm going to take that variable now, you see, and just put it in here. Remember, and that's continuous variable. I know it's continuous also. Remember, the little scale lets me know that that's a continuous or scale variable, the little ruler. If it had the little circles there, I know that that's categorical, gender, okay? So now I can go into the options. And remember, this is where I tell it to give me whatever my application was asking me for. So I need a mean, I need a standard deviation. As you can see, I need a variance. It asked me for a range. It asked me for, the distribution. Was it normal? And I can get the kurtosis and skewness measures. The same thing we did in the presentation. Okay, and when we hit continue, and then I hit OK, then the output's going to come out. And the other thing I'll show you, and as you can see here, now if we look at this total perceived stress variable, here are all the statistics. As you can see, the skewness values, you see the range, you see that's the maximum, 46 minus 12, remember 36, the average, the standard deviation, here's the variance, you see the skewness values. So again, just follow the instructions and you should be able to select. And again, when you get into the data set, my friends, for the continuous variable, I recommend you grab a scale variable, okay? And you'll be fine with your descriptive statistics and grab the nominal for a categorical variable. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? So you don't want to run mean, median, mode for a nominal variable. Okay, you don't want to do that. You can't get an average of a male and a female. You can't get an average of categories. You can get a count of categories. How many were in the work category? How many were in this category? That's very important. I really want to make sure that you grasp this because you'll see just how important that is as you progress through this course and start talking about the scales of measurement and running any type of an analysis that you have to do. You have to consider that scale of measurement. And I just put the link to the survey in the chat. It should be the very bottom link, okay? So does everybody feel a little bit better now? And think you can have a good night's sleep and not be too worried and too anxiety ridden because you kind of have an understanding now of what's going on when we start describing data. Again, remember, we must understand the scale of measurement of the variable, and meaning the nominal, that will be when we do the categorical response for our assignment. And remember the interval and ratio will represent the scale. Now you can also do it with an ordinal as a scale variable. It's a numerical value, okay? So you choose, make sure you just don't choose the wrong scales of measurement. So we good to go until we meet again. Now, finally, one final thing is remember to check back at the ORD's website because you normally get an email notification from somewhere within your program that a training session is coming up, if I'm correct. But what I want you to really get comfortable in doing is to not rely on an email. Suppose someone doesn't send that email out when I send the announcement out to the program directors. Well, you're just out of luck there, right? So what I want you to get familiar with is going to the ORD's website, okay? and this is the Office of Research and Doctoral Services, okay? And when you get out there and you get to the quantitative SPSS and support, you'll see again, this is the link that I put in there that shows you what will come up. So you should see something hopefully here in the next day or two of what's upcoming and what seminar is upcoming. And that way, if you never get an email from someone that forgot to send the link out or whatever the case may be, you know where to go check. Does that make sense to everybody? That's how you'll find out what's going on. And again, if there's a week that comes up, and let's just say that last week, week 10 or week 11, and you have to do the chi-square test, you don't see any upcoming seminar or nothing, you will simply click on the chi-square test of association for an on-demand, already previously recorded session. Okay? So other than that, I don't have anything else. What I'll do is I will just leave the classroom open for a while so that everyone can get, whatever links they need out of the class. Spread the word to your friends, your colleagues, send them our way, send them my way. And we'll be here to help you throughout your quantitative journey. Okay, so please know that I'm here to support you, but I need to know what you need, and you can tell me that via the survey. Okay, so thank you, my friends. Have a good evening until we meet again, which will hopefully be next week. If not, the confidence intervals and all that type of stuff, I believe there is a presentation right here based on all that type of information if we don't have a live one. Okay, so the resources are there. Have a great evening, and I will see you next week, hopefully. So please take advantage of that survey for me. Thank you very much.